All right, let's bring John in here on a Wednesday edition of the Sports Bash, 97.3 ESPN. Counting down the teams chasing the Eagles. We're taking two teams a day, leading you up to July 25th when the Eagles return to training camp. And, John, they announced today that there's going to be a couple opportunities for you to see them live at Lincoln Financial Field. This is something they've been doing the last couple of years since they no longer go out to Lehigh.
Yeah, big difference from the old days, as you mentioned, Lehigh, even before that, Westchester, where you could go out to see basically any practice. NFL has changed, not just the Eagles. A lot of teams hold training camp at their own particular facilities. Eagles are one of them, and obviously training camp is much shorter now. July really... You mentioned July 25th report. It's really July 26th first practice, and then I think August 14th is the last day. So it's less than 3 weeks, and bang, you're off to going in the preseason and setting up for the regular season.
Yeah, and the Eagles have two open training camp practices. That's it for them, and obviously they've been really quiet the last couple of weeks, and you would expect that. But we asked a question a little earlier. I don't know. I don't know. I asked if people's excitement has been diminished because they won the Super Bowl, or is it enhanced this season? Like, do you feel that this time of the year, like I felt in the past that the Eagles fans have typically been like rip-roaring ready for training camp, and now I feel it's just like, we won the Super Bowl.
Well, I think there's, when we talk about Super Bowl hangovers, that's one of the things we talk about. It's human nature to kind of sit back and relax and say, hey, we got that. And that's what happens to certain teams. So, yeah, it can happen to a fan base. But, I remember we were talking about this last year because people weren't really that high on Doug Peterson.
Right. The team itself, people weren't excited about.
Yeah. And what happens? They win Super Bowl 52. So, generally in this town, I think, maybe there's been a shift in sports in general, because I think you see it in all sports. And there isn't much excitement, or at least as much as I remember in earlier years. So, the Phillies are in first place. You don't kind of feel that oomph with them. But the Eagles, at least when it gets going, the people are going to get excited.
Yeah, I would think that once they, get to camp and everything's happening, people will start, consuming it a lot more. And you just mentioned it. We were just talking before you came on, John, about, baseball, the issues that they're having, that essentially summer league basketball games almost have, I don't want to say almost, I think the ratings are better for that than they are baseball games.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Obviously, we've talked about it a lot. I think Philadelphia is a little bit different because there's so much interest in sort of the off the court stuff with the Sixers and the team building and how they're going about it. So Summer League has, and really, if you think about when the team was really bad, it was often sort of that. People would check it on the calendar and be more excited about the Summer League than the actual real games. Now that they're a good team again, and you want to see some of the young players, I can't really explain why people aren't more excited about the Phillies. It doesn't make a lot of sense, other than they got a little bit spoiled by that run. Obviously Chase Utley, Ryan Howard, Jimmy Rollins, that team. I think people got a little spoiled.
Possible. I find it interesting because the Sixers, a team that was bad for 3-4 seasons in a row, and the first season that they became somewhat relevant, they're selling out every night. The Phillies have been bad for 3, 4, 5 seasons in a row, and now they're good, and it hasn't translated that to have that instantaneous. The Sixers had that instant spark even before the season. The Phillies, yeah, maybe you didn't have high expectations, but you feel like once you got into first place, it was like, all right, our baseball's back, and that it would instantly kind of connect again. That hasn't really happened.
Well, the only difference I see is that sort of this generation knows what a good baseball team looks like. They saw a great baseball team. And this team is good, but it's not great. It's not that type of team. They've never really seen a great basketball team. You got to go back, far past even the 2001 team. You really got to go back to the Irving teams, Moses, Malone, that group. And most of the people have never really seen a truly great basketball team. And that's where I bring out the spoiled part of it. I think they were spoiled a little bit by that Phillies team and the run they had. And now they want, why can't we have that? And it's not easy to have that.
Sure isn't. And it's just a pretty interesting spot where sports are right now. A lot of sports are changing. We had the conversation about the shift going on in baseball, basketball. I can recall John hosting this show, 2008, 2009, 2010. We barely talked NBA. Sixers were completely irrelevant. Nobody engaged with Sixers conversation during that time.
Yeah, I think it was pretty much, and I've said this a lot with the Sixers and Flyers, really, and even the Phillies to a degree. The excitement, the interest is generally only there when they're making a run, when they're really good in the playoffs. And the one team that kind of, at least there's a significant level of interest, good, bad, indifferent, whether it's frustration when they're bad, is the Eagles. But even that, I think, if you look about the last year of the Chip Kelly regime, if you look about the last few games of Doug Pearson's first year, even then when he had a below-average team, people kind of checked out.
Yeah.
And that's really the first time I've seen that with football. So I think maybe it's just a shift, and maybe a younger generation isn't quite as interested, unfortunately, in sports as maybe some of the older generation.
John McMullen, the NFL, we're counting down 2 teams every day, chasing the Eagles. They're trying to bring down the Birds for the Lombardi Trophy. Today, we're going to take a look at the Baltimore Ravens, a team that typically, John, when the season would begin, you would put the Ravens in the conversation for Super Bowl contender. Can we do that with this team?
I don't think so. I think playoff contender is legit if you look at it that way. But even though the AFC isn't as deep as the NFC, I don't see them being the type of surprise team. But if you would have asked me that question about the Eagles last year, I would have said the same thing. Maybe if everything went right, they can make the playoffs, but certainly not going to be a Super Bowl team. So there's drastic changes in the NFL from year to year. We talk about it all the time. And if Baltimore is one of those teams that's talented enough, if they catch lightning, you never know what's going to happen. But if you look at them on paper, you certainly wouldn't say they're better than Pittsburgh or New England or Jacksonville.
Quarterback, Flacco, they drafted Lamar Jackson. Robert Griffin III is there. So do you think this is an interesting storyline in training camp for Baltimore?
Not really. I mean, people will be excited because Lamar's a rookie and a first-round pick, but people around the Ravens kind of know that this is still Joe Flacco's team for now. They can't move on from him because of the prohibitive nature of his contract. They're not going to pay a backup quarterback over $20 million, so it's not a legitimate competition. Joe's going to be the starter. And I think in a lot of ways that's good for Lamar Jackson because he gets an opportunity that the other first-round picks aren't going to have, and that's the ability to sit and learn and take things a little bit slower.
John McMullen's with us. We're looking at 2 teams every day chasing the Eagles right now. Baltimore, Michael Crabtree is in, John Brown, Willie Snead. So names that you might be familiar with, but is this an upgrade for Flacco? That's been a problem since he's been there, right?
Yeah, I do think it's an upgrade, but you mentioned all those names you just mentioned are new. And you talk about the chemistry and you talk about the lack of work you get in the off season. And we just talked about how training camps are shorter. And there's not any more two-a-days. There's not as many practices. And all of a sudden you have 3 new receivers. That's been an issue for Baltimore for years, getting playmakers at wide receiver. Rashad Perriman's the one guy who remains a former first-round pick that's been a bust. So, I mean, Crabtree and Brown and Willie Snead, those are going to be the guys that play the majority of the snaps on this offense as long as they're healthy. And you want to see how that chemistry develops between them and Joe Flacco.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team that, even in their great years, John, they were not a great offensive team. I mean, they were typically known for that defense.
Yeah, one of the great defenses of all time, really the first Ravens Super Bowl team. And you know, I think the second one was a little bit more well-rounded, but even then with Terrell Suggs was more of a defensive-oriented team. So it's always been sort of defense and even special teams first, if you think about, obviously, John Harbaugh and his history here as being one of the great special teams coaches and being one of those rare guys that made the leap to being a head coach. He did get to be a secondary coach, I think, for a year here before he got the job. But nonetheless, you don't see that leap happen very often. And the Ravens have always been very good on special teams, and that continues. Obviously, they have Justin Tucker, might be the best kicker I've ever seen. And if Pete was there, he'd certainly be talking about that.
Although I drafted him in my fantasy league last year thinking I was getting a steal, and he wasn't that good last year. Not as good as he normally had been. And that part of that's because he didn't get as many opportunities, and that's because that offense is not very good. And their offensive line was a problem last year. Their guard, Yonda, was hurt. I mean, so they had all sorts of – it seems that injuries have really been a problem for them, not only last year, the last couple of years.
Yeah, and it's one of those things when we often talk about how do you win a Super Bowl. Well, part of it is you got to put yourself in position. You certainly got to build a good roster. You got to have exceptional talent, but you do also have to have a little bit of luck. And maybe one of the most impressive things about the Eagles, besides winning the Super Bowl, is they were able to do it with so many injuries. Typically, that does not happen. And everybody certainly wants to stay healthy, but you're right. The Ravens are one team. The Chargers are another. Seem to be always stricken with that injury bug, and you hope sort of it regresses back to the mean and you have a relatively healthy year.
John, I was just in Baltimore, and when you ride on one of the tourist sightseeing boats out there, there's a mural that they bring your attention to of Michael Phelps, Cal Ripken, and Ray Lewis. I'm looking at the Baltimore defense. I see Carl Davis, Michael Pierce, Brandon Williams, Matthew Judon, Albert McMullen. I see no Ray Lewis on this squad.
Well, you still got Suggs. I mean, Suggs is I think this might be 15th or 16th year. He's going to the Hall of Fame. There's one of the great pass rushers, one of the great edge rushers of all time. He's still there. C.J. Mosley is still there at linebacker. You mentioned some of those names. I mean, they might not be household names, but Brandon Williams, for instance, he's one of the best run stuffers in football. Michael Pierce, they're so big up front, they're tough to run on. And the secondary, Eric Weddle is an all-pro safety. Tony Jefferson's good. Brandon Carr, Jimmy Smith. They have a lot of talent on the defensive side of the football. It might not be Ray Lewis. Everybody in the nation knows who they are.
Eric Weddle, by the way,
it's a good group.
Yep, Eric Weddle, yeah. Tony Jefferson, a couple of good safeties. No, and my point was kind of, this is an under-the-radar defense. Maybe back at the time when they were winning the Super Bowl, they had Hall of Fame-level defense.
Yeah, I mean, Ray's one of the great linebackers of all time. I think the only guy who would be in that category would be Suggs, and he's on the downside of his career, but he's still a very effective, very competent player. And you're right. I mean, generally, besides probably Weddle as well, who's been an All-Pro for a number of years, most of the other guys are kind of unknown, but Mosley specifically. I would say Mosley and Brandon Williams. Those are Pro Bowl type players.
John McMullen's with us, counting down 2 teams every day, chasing the Eagles. It has a great ring to it, doesn't it? You're chasing the Eagles for the Super Bowl. All of these teams don't have it. The Eagles do. The next team on our list, the Detroit Lions. And this is a team that perpetually can't get out of its own way. One of the few teams remaining that has not gotten to the Super Bowl. And I would assume, John, at the start of this year, we're not looking at the Lions as a Super Bowl contender.
Well, it's difficult. It's a difficult division, number one, when you have Minnesota and you have Green Bay with presumably a healthy Aaron Rodgers. So that's part of the problem. But I think Detroit's better than people think they are. And I think it starts with the quarterback and Matthew Stafford. He's one of the most – he's sort of like the superstar quarterback that nobody thinks is a superstar. He's extremely difficult to deal with. He can beat you. He's more mobile than people think he is, and probably, you know, as far as top 5 arm strength, top 5 accuracy, he's in that group. So if they ever do get the rest of the roster together, I think people are going to wake up one day and go, wow, Matthew Stafford's really good.
Yeah. It's just weird to say that because most of the time when you have a quarterback of that caliber, you're at least a playoff team. And I know they have been in the playoffs, but it's been hit or miss. Like, you know, when you have that level of quarterback, it's almost like –
it hasn't been consistent.
Correct,
yeah.
correct.
It hasn't been consistent. One of it is they've had absolutely no run game for about the past 5 years.
That looks like it's changed.
Yeah, they brought in LeGarrette, number 1. So LeGarrette Blount will be there, and you know he's going to be somewhat competent. Amir Abdullah still there. He's been a big disappointment. And then I have a great third down back in Theo Riddick. He's a tremendous receiver out of the backfield, but he's not going to help you as a bell cow running football. So I think LeGarrette has I'm not going to say he's going to go to another Super Bowl with another different team, but he's got a chance to be impactful and turn that from sort of a 9-7 team to an 11-win team and be a playoff team. I really believe Stafford's that good, and if you could at least get him a competent running game. And then you talk about their receivers. Their receivers are great. Golden Tate, Marvin Jones, and Kenny Galladay is a guy that people don't know. But he's one of the biggest receivers in football. The Lions think he's going to be a star. This is one of the teams that could surprise people.
Yeah, and you know they did hire a defensive coordinator, defensive-minded coach. What do you think of Patricia as the hiring there? I mean, you're talking about the problems they've had on offense. Now they've had some problems on defense too, but do you think that they might simplify the offense and that could help them?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll have to see. If you think about Bill Belichick and his assistants going on as head coaches, the track record isn't great, to be honest. It's really bad. I don't know why. I can't explain it. I think every situation is different. Josh McDaniels, for instance, I think he was just unprepared. He got a job in Denver too early in his career. You know, you talk about guys like Romeo Crennel, obviously was an organization that never wins. So who knows? But I will say that Matt Patricia's coming into a situation where he's got more than the typical Belichick assistant. So we'll see if he can do a better job. But, yeah, his expertise is obviously on the defensive side of the football, and they have some talent there as well. I mean, Ziggy Ansah is a great edge rusher. They have a real one of the best secondaries I think people don't know about. Specifically, Darius Slay is one of the best corners.
Yep.
Glover Quinn is a great safety. So I think this is one of the teams that could surprise people.
John McMullen, we're counting down the teams chasing the Eagles. 2 teams every day, Baltimore and right now Detroit is what we're taking a look at. And one of the Lions, issues is pass rush. I mean, they have not been able to do anything on the defensive side of the ball, and we're thinking that's one of the reasons they should be helped in that area, which could make them a much better team because their defense was pretty bad last year.
Yeah, and part of that was obviously Ansah wasn't completely healthy, and then they haven't had the complement, which has been the issue. If you have, I think if you look around the NFL, everybody seemingly has one good pass rusher, but if you don't have that complement, if you don't have a second and a third guy, it's pretty easy to get people blocked because you can double team them and single up everybody else, and you tend to have issues. So they got to find that second guy, and I'm not sure. Kerry Hyder's, they're hoping he put up some numbers at one point, but he was down with an Achilles. So I'm not completely sold on him being the answer. And if you look at the rest of their roster, there's nobody that's going to jump out at you as a potential compliment, as I said, to Ansah. So that's probably, if you ask me, their biggest weakness, I would point to that.
And you mentioned Slay. I mean, the fact that their corners, they've got some decent corners back there, and but they're young. I mean, the fact that this defense, the back end, is pretty young. So it'll be interesting bringing Ansah back there because I'm definitely interested to see what Patricia does because they got some decent guys on that side of the ball. But for the big part of this team's issues for years, as you mentioned, has been the running game. But it seems like, all right, they went out and they drafted a back. They brought in Blunt. They got the quarterback. They've got some decent receivers now. Is this finally the year that the Lions, though, they're in a tough division. They got Green Bay and they've got Minnesota to contend with. So did they do enough to jump over? Because I don't see three teams from that division getting in.
No, but we've seen it in the past, and if there is one division that could send three teams, I think the NFC North is going to be one of those divisions you would think has the potential to do that. But I think the Lions, as I said, has the potential to surprise. You mentioned all the talent. Their offensive line is better as well. And they drafted Frank Ragnow in the first round, and Taylor Decker will be back healthy. So, look, we talk about first-place schedules. That might take Minnesota back to the pack a little bit.
Interesting.
I don't know if Green Bay is tremendously talented. I would say this, the Lions from 1 through 53 are better than the Packers, but the Packers have Aaron Rodgers.
That's right. Well, but the Lions have Matthew Stafford.
Yeah, but you just heard how much I like Matthew Stafford, but he's not Aaron Rodgers. There's sort of a leap up.
Few are, John. Few are.
Yeah, to superstar, and that's the difference. So can they go from 9-7 to a 10-11 win team? If you're 10-11 wins, you're probably going to be in the playoffs. I think they have the potential to do that, and I think talent-wise, they're the second best team in that division.
Real quick, before we let John run, the attorney for Delisha Gordon, the victim in the alleged home invasion, bizarre story with LeSean McCoy that we touched on yesterday, released a statement today. What is the latest on what we do know with LeSean McCoy?
Well, the accusations are plain, and that's obviously, LeSean was not there. That's clear. He was in Miami, but the allegations are that he set up his ex-girlfriend to be robbed and beaten. And if that's the case, and the police department down there is still investigating leads. They have released a statement, and they have been clear that this was a targeted event. It was not just a robbery on the spur of the moment. There was no forced entry. So this is someone who had the ability to get into the house without the knowledge of the woman. And that's concerning because obviously LeSean McCoy owns the house. So there are going to be questions that Shady McCoy has to answer. And as I said yesterday, it's unfair to completely label him guilty, but these are serious allegations and questions need to be answered. And the fact that he was in Miami does not mean he was not involved in this incident.
Crazy story. Bizarre as continues to unfold. We'll keep our eye on it. John McMullen's at JF McMullen. You can read his national NFL column at getmoresports.com. Sirius Radio had Rasul Douglas on today. He ranked the Eagles secondary numero uno, John. Are the Eagles the best group in the NFL?
It's a good group. I would not say they're number one, but that cornerback group specifically has gone from weakness to strength in record time. Rasul's part of that, and it's very young. It's also a very young group with Jalen Mills, Ronald Darby, Sidney Jones, Rasul, Avante Maddox. Question is, can they find a nickel back? And then safeties, Malcolm is a great player. Rodney is solid, but you got to find that third safety. So 2 question marks for the Eagles as we head toward training camp in the secondary, and that's third safety and slot corner.
And John is previewing the units at 97.3ESPN.com. The offensive line is the latest that he's taken a look at, and you can check that out at 97.3ESPN.com. John McMullen, like all guys, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Take care, John.
Take care, Mike.